Hello, could you help me grow this channel? Subscribing is totally free. Just one click below this video is all it takes.
You know the kind of Thanksgiving where the turkey's barely on the table before someone starts passing out compliments like mashed potatoes? Yeah, that's how it goes every damn year in my family. Only the compliments always seem to stop at my brother's end of the table. It's like some unspoken family tradition that no one has the guts to admit is just favoritism dressed up as small talk. And every year I sit there, fork in hand, watching my parents beam at Eric like he's the second coming of Steve Jobs with dental tools, because of course, he's a dentist, which in my mother's eyes is about 3 steps shy of royalty. I don't hate my brother, not exactly. It's not that simple. Hate takes too much energy. What I feel is something heavier, quieter, a constant hum of being underestimated. Eric's been the one since we were kids. He was the prom king with the perfect teeth and the straight A's, while I was the weird girl who sketched in the margins of her notebook and had more ideas than social skills. He got accepted into dental school, and they framed the acceptance letter like it was a Nobel Prize. I got into a decent college on a partial scholarship, and my mom said, "Well, at least you'll have something to fall back on if your art doesn't work out." That was her version of encouragement. I think I was 19 when I realized my family loved me, just not with the same flavor they reserved for Eric. Their love for him was loud, shiny, public. Mine was tolerated. So here we are again, Thanksgiving. I fly in from Seattle, knowing exactly how it's going to go. Mom's house smells like cinnamon, wine, and underlying resentment. She greets me with the same line she's used since I was 25. "You look tired, honey. Are you eating enough?" And when Eric walks in 10 minutes later with his wife and 2 overly polite kids, she lights up like a Christmas tree that's been waiting all year to be plugged in. The wine starts flowing, and so do the stories. Eric's new practice, Eric's new boat, Eric's kids who apparently read at a 12th grade level even though they're in 3rd. Meanwhile, I sit at the edge of the couch, sipping wine, nodding at the right times, half listening while wondering why I even bother flying out here. They don't ask about my life, not really. They throw out polite questions with expiration dates like, "Still doing your little thing with computers?" And when I say, "It's going well," they nod like I just said I got a new pair of socks. But here's the thing. I've built something real. Over the past 4 years, while Eric's been adding a wine fridge to his kitchen and collecting praise like participation trophies, I've been eating ramen and pitching investors in badly lit coffee shops. I started my tech company in a basement that reeked of mildew and old paint, with 2 secondhand laptops and a friend from college who believed in me more than my own family ever did. And now, we've got 22 employees. We just signed a contract with a company whose name would actually make my parents' jaws drop if I ever told them. But I didn't, not yet, because I knew how this would play out. I've played the quiet one for too long, and this time, I wanted the silence to build into something explosive. As we sit around the dining table, passing dishes and exchanging pleasantries, I watch the show unfold like it does every year. My mom brings up Eric's latest renovation. Apparently, he knocked down a wall to make room for a home gym. My dad chuckles and says, "That's my way, always improving." No one asks me what I've been working on. No one even remembers what I do. I'm a footnote in my own family. And you know what? That used to make me feel like I was failing. But this year, something shifted. I've been holding something in my purse that I never thought I'd have the nerve to bring out. A stack of business cards, simple and elegant, printed on thick matte stock with embossed letters. It doesn't say much, just my name, the company, and the words, Founder and CEO. It's not flashy, but it's real. And for once, I want that reality to hit them in the face the way their constant dismissal has hit me for decades. I look around the table at the people I'm supposed to feel closest to, and I realize something. They don't actually know me, not the real me. They've been too busy loving the version of me that doesn't make waves, that doesn't upstage the golden boy, that doesn't embarrass them by succeeding in ways they don't understand. And I'm done playing that part. The turkey is still warm, the cranberry sauce untouched, and the wine's just starting to settle into everyone's bloodstream. Perfect timing. Because this year, I didn't just come home for Thanksgiving. I came to settle a score. There's a certain kind of silence that lives between siblings when the roles have been too clearly assigned since childhood. The silence that forms not because you've run out of things to say, but because you were never really allowed to speak in the first place. Growing up with Eric meant living with a living, breathing benchmark, one that smiled with perfect teeth and came with his own personal applause track. He was the son, and I was told, in more ways than one, that my job was to stay in orbit. When he scored a goal in Little League, they hung the jersey on the wall like a trophy. When I wrote a short story that got published in the local paper, they asked if it was a class assignment. Eric got grounded once, just once. And even that came with a 10-minute apology from Mom for being too harsh. I, on the other hand, learned early on that discipline wasn't a bad word when it applied to me. But what stuck with me more than anything was the way praise shaped our identities. His confidence fed like a bonfire on a windy night, and mine left to survive like a lone candle in a cold basement. I didn't envy him, not exactly. I envied the ease with which he existed. I envied how he never had to explain his worth, how every dinner table became a stage for his triumphs, and how our parents would sit there, nodding like bobbleheads, as if every sentence out of his mouth was scripture. And so I learned to keep my wins to myself, not because I didn't want to share them, but because I knew that the moment I did, they'd be compared, minimized, or dismissed with a polite nod and a quick subject change. After enough years of that, you stop offering up your victories. You bury them instead, stack them like poker chips behind your back, waiting for the right hand to go all in. After college, a quiet, uncelebrated acceptance into a state school, I bounced from job to job, most of which weren't glamorous, and none of which earned me more than a shrug from my mother when I mentioned them on the phone. I was finding myself, which in my family translated to not living up to expectations. Meanwhile, Eric opened his first practice at 32, got his name on the door, and suddenly our parents acted like he'd personally reinvented dentistry. I still remember that Christmas when he handed out branded toothbrushes with his logo on them, and my mom cried because she was just so proud. I had designed an entire app that had over 50,000 downloads by then. I didn't mention it. I had learned not to. But something in me, something stubborn, maybe even reckless, refused to let my story end as the quiet disappointment. It started with a late-night conversation over boxed wine with my best friend Mara, who looked at me dead in the eye and said, "You're playing small for people who wouldn't notice if you went big." That hit hard, so I started building. Nights, weekends, lunch breaks. Whenever I had a moment to breathe, I poured it into what would eventually become my startup. It began as a side hustle, then grew teeth, then claws. We launched officially 3 years ago, and every day since has been an uphill sprint. Investors, hires, failures, relaunches, and late-night panic attacks. It was all part of it. And now, we've got contracts, real revenue, people who depend on me for their paychecks. The kind of responsibility that would probably terrify my parents if they ever looked past Eric's business cards and noticed mine. But I kept it quiet, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't owe them an explanation for something they never asked about. And maybe, deep down, I liked the idea of being underestimated. There's a strange power in knowing people don't see you coming. I'd show up to family dinners dressed nicely but not too nice, careful not to trigger suspicion. I let them believe I was still figuring things out. They seemed more comfortable that way, like my potential was a safe concept, one they could pity or ignore, but never fear. Because if they knew the truth, if they knew what I was sitting on, what I had actually built, it might have threatened the whole structure they'd spent years maintaining, that Eric was the one who made it, and I was the one who tried. I guess I didn't plan the reveal. Not exactly. I just knew that if the moment ever came, I'd be ready. And this year, something in the air told me that moment was closer than ever. It was in the way my mother's eyes glazed over when I mentioned Seattle. It was in the way Dad chuckled politely at my jokes like I was still 16. It was in the way Eric sat at the table like he owned it, offering stories about patient emergencies and expanding clinics like he was the captain of industry. They'd set the stage again, the spotlight ready, the applause cued. But this time, I wasn't going to watch from the wings. Not this year. Not after everything I'd built, sacrificed, risked. I had waited long enough in the shadows of their expectations. And as the cranberry sauce slid across plates and the first toast was made, of course to Eric, for his latest milestone, I felt the edges of my patience start to fray. Aunt Janice, bless her booze-soaked honesty, glanced at me across the table and said, "And what's Natalie been up to? Still doing that tech thing?" Everyone chuckled softly, like she'd just told a clever joke. I smiled so wide my jaw hurt. Because they had no idea. Not yet. But they would. There's a particular kind of tension that sits in the air just before something shifts in a room. Not the loud kind that comes from slamming doors or screaming matches, but the quiet, creeping pressure that crawls up your spine, that sharpens every word and glance, that makes your heartbeat sync up with the hum of the refrigerator and the clicking of a fork against porcelain. That's what it felt like as the roast turkey made its final pass around the table, and everyone began settling into the second glass of wine. Bellies warm, faces flushed, and egos comfortably inflated by the glow of their own stories. That was the moment I chose, not because I had planned it down to the minute, but because I had learned, over the years, to recognize when a room had reached peak smugness. And my family, especially my mother, had a way of creating those moments like clockwork. Eric was in the middle of retelling a story about a root canal emergency, something that, in any other setting, might have been mildly disgusting or at least a cue for someone to change the subject. But in our family, it was treated with the reverence usually reserved for military medals or space missions. He described the patient's pain, the heroic way he handled it, and of course, how the grateful family had sent him a gift basket with a note saying he had changed their lives. The table erupted with approving nods, my mother practically glowing as she said something about how not everyone has the hands and heart for that kind of work. My father chuckled in agreement, swirling his wine like he was tasting the vintage of success. And then came the moment, that exact moment when my own silence, which had been politely interpreted as shyness or irrelevance for most of my adult life, finally shifted from being an afterthought to something just a little too pointed. Aunt Janice, ever the unfiltered oracle of truth, wrapped in too much perfume and too many pearls, looked at me over the rim of her glass and said, "And what about you, Natalie? Got any fun stories from your startup? That's still going?" Her tone wasn't mean exactly, just soaked in the same brand of skepticism that had followed me around every Thanksgiving since I first mentioned I was building something. I looked at her, then at my mother, then at Eric, who smirked slightly, as if preparing himself for another one of my soft, vague updates about still working on some things or in talks with investors. The room, in its own subtle way, was leaning forward, not out of interest but expectation. They were expecting me to dodge, to minimize, to deflect, and quietly return to the side dish I hadn't touched in 10 minutes. And for a second, I almost did. I almost let them have that version of me again. But then I reached into my purse, slowly and deliberately, and pulled out a business card. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't gold-plated or overly designed. It was clean, simple, and unmistakable. I slid it across the table, not toward anyone in particular, just placing it in the center like a dealer laying down the first card of a very dangerous hand. "If anyone's looking for a job," I said calmly, "we're hiring." The silence that followed wasn't loud or sudden. It was surgical. It sliced right through the noise of dinner, cutting the laughter off mid-breath and leaving nothing but the ticking of the wall clock and the distant clink of silverware as someone nervously shifted in their seat. My mother froze, mid-sip, her wineglass hovering just below her lips. My father blinked slowly, trying to process what I'd said. Aunt Janice raised her eyebrows, a slow, impressed whistle escaping her lips. But the best part, the part I'll never forget, was Eric. He had just taken a sip of his wine, and as the words registered, he literally choked on it, sputtering slightly, trying to play it off like it went down the wrong pipe. He coughed, reached for a napkin, and stared at the card like it had grown legs and threatened him. He recovered quickly, of course. Eric always had a way of regaining control, even in the most awkward moments. And with a practiced laugh, he said, "That's cute. You guys hiring for interns, or what is it exactly you do again?" His tone was easy, but his eyes weren't. His eyes were scanning, calculating, realizing that something had shifted, even if he didn't know just how much yet. I didn't smile, I didn't blink. I just looked him straight in the face and said, "We're expanding. We just signed with a nationwide logistics company and need to double headcount before Q2. Developers, ops, support staff, take your pick." And there it was, that moment of visible recalibration, where someone who thought they understood the game suddenly realizes they've been playing with the wrong rulebook. My mother cleared her throat, tried to steer the conversation back to safer waters by asking about Eric's new office furniture, but the spell had been broken. The air was different now. The hierarchy, if only briefly, had been disrupted. Aunt Janice, bless her soul, leaned over, picked up the card, and read it aloud. "Founder and CEO, well damn, Nat, I had no idea you were actually legit." I nodded once, still calm, letting the silence settle again, knowing full well that this was only the beginning. Because the thing about revealing the truth isn't just the moment itself, it's the aftershocks. It's the way people start to question what else they've missed, what else you've been holding back, what other assumptions they've made that might now be falling apart. Eric looked like he wanted to say something, but he didn't, not yet, and that told me everything I needed to know. They weren't ready, but they would be. There's a strange, almost addictive satisfaction in watching people recalibrate their entire understanding of you in real time, especially when those people have spent decades building a version of you that served their comfort better than it ever served your truth. And sitting at that dinner table, with my business card lying there like a lit match on a dry floor, I could see the beginnings of a fire they weren't prepared to put out. My mother, ever the poised orchestrator of family image and tightly controlled narratives, had fixed her expression into something between confusion and mild concern, not out of genuine curiosity, but more like she was trying to figure out if this unexpected reveal would tarnish the shine she'd spent years polishing on Eric's life. As if my success, presented without her permission or prior knowledge, somehow felt like a threat to the family's emotional ecosystem. Eric, on the other hand, was sitting unnaturally still, his jaw tight, his wine untouched now, clearly calculating what this meant in the unspoken scoreboard we'd both pretended didn't exist but knew all too well had been running in the background since the very first time he got a gold star and I got a participation ribbon. He was the type who thrived on predictability, on being the first to announce, the first to succeed, the first to impress. And this surprise, this moment where the spotlight had moved without his control, didn't sit right with him, and I could see it gnawing at him in the way his eyes kept flicking between the card and me, trying to piece together the timeline of a story he didn't even know had started. It was Aunt Janice who broke the silence again, God bless her unpredictable lack of tact, swirling her third glass of Pinot, like a judge twirling a gavel and asking, "So what exactly do you do, Nat? I mean, what kind of company are we talking here? Is it one of those apps for dog walkers or food deliveries?" There was no malice in her voice, just that typical cocktail of generational disconnect and tipsy bluntness, and I leaned forward slightly, meeting her gaze without hesitation, because this was the moment I'd built in secret, the quiet climax of years of biting my tongue and letting them all believe whatever made them sleep better at night. "It's a logistics platform," I said, keeping my voice even but firm, "built for businesses that manage high-volume, multi-location operations. Inventory tracking, predictive analytics, and real-time route optimization. We've just signed a national supply chain deal with a distribution company that services over 400 warehouses. I let the words hang in the air for a second, long enough for the weight of them to settle into their ears, long enough for them to realize this wasn't a hobby or a phase or something I did between yoga classes and Instagram posts. This was real, structured, scalable, and already in motion. My mother's lips parted slightly, but no words came out, and when she finally managed to speak, all she said was, "That sounds complicated," which was about as close as she'd ever get to admitting she didn't understand something. My father looked genuinely surprised, the kind of surprise that made me wonder if he'd ever actually considered what I might be capable of outside the tiny frame they'd all squeezed me into. And for once, he didn't look at Eric before reacting. He looked at me, just me, and there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not pride, not yet, but something that looked suspiciously like the beginning of respect. But it was Eric's response that changed the temperature in the room. He leaned back slowly, forced a chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes, and said, "Well, hey, that's great. I mean, good for you. Always nice to see passion projects get some traction." His tone was calm, almost congratulatory, but there was an edge to it, a hairline crack in the polished veneer, and I saw through it immediately. He was pissed. Not because I had succeeded, but because I hadn't asked for permission to do it. Because I hadn't warned him. Because I had dared to grow in the shadows of his spotlight, and now, suddenly, he had to share the stage. And that's when I dropped the second card. Not a literal one this time, but something I had been saving, unsure if I'd ever use it, but knowing it would cut deeper than any business title ever could. I glanced at him, then at the table, then back to him, and said casually, "Funny timing, actually. We were reviewing a list of dental tech companies recently, considering acquisition options. One of the firms that came up is in your region. Small practice, good customer reviews, but their software's outdated and their margins are thin. Sound familiar?" The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't just stunned, it was threatened. Eric's face didn't move, but I could see it in his eyes, in the way his hand tensed around the stem of his glass, in the way his wife shifted uncomfortably beside him, not yet understanding what had just been said, but clearly sensing the atmosphere shift. Aunt Janice's eyes widened, and she leaned in like she was watching a courtroom drama unfold in real life. My mother, to her credit, recovered quickly and said something about refilling the gravy boat, but no one moved. "I'm kidding," I said with a small shrug, though my tone left just enough ambiguity to keep the unease simmering. "Probably not yours, but you'd be surprised how many dental practices are struggling to modernize. A lot of them are just one tech upgrade away from going under." I didn't look at him when I said it. I didn't need to, because in that moment, everything changed. The illusion cracked. The golden boy had been challenged, not by force or confrontation, but by competence. The one thing none of them ever expected from me. And as the table tried to return to small talk and dessert trays and polite laughter, the undercurrent of tension didn't dissipate. It thickened, because for the first time, they weren't sure who I was anymore. And for the first time, I didn't care. The strange thing about power, especially the kind that's been manufactured, gifted, and carefully protected for years at facade, inside the cushioned comfort of family dynamics, is that once someone dares to tug at its foundation, even gently, the whole facade begins to tremble, not because the one in power has been defeated, but because they suddenly realize the illusion only worked as long as everyone agreed to pretend it was real. That night, as dessert plates were being cleared and coffee was being poured with forced smiles and tighter than usual politeness, I could feel the unraveling, not loud, not messy, but precise and inevitable, like a sweater thread slipping through one's fingers, pulling apart decades of carefully curated delusion one loop at a time. Eric hadn't spoken much since I made the offhand and entirely intentional comment about the dental practices under review by my company, but his silence spoke louder than any retort could have. He was quiet in that particular way that only happens when a person is forced to confront the limits of their control, And though he tried to compose himself behind a smug half-smile and a few weak jokes to his kids, the tension around his shoulders betrayed the truth. I had hit something soft, something vulnerable, and he was still deciding how to respond without losing the one thing he had always held over me, the image of being untouchable. The room was performing normalcy in the most uncomfortable way imaginable. My mother, perhaps sensing that the conversation had veered off script and into uncharted territory, was rambling about how different the holidays had become now that the kids were all grown, her words tinged with the brittle desperation of someone trying to glue a broken plate back together in front of the guests. My father, who had always avoided conflict with the expertise of a man who believed silence could solve everything, nodded along, stirring his coffee like it might offer him an escape. Aunt Janice, God love her, looked like she wanted to light a cigarette right there at the table, her eyes darting between us with gleeful anticipation, as if this dinner had become the kind of drama she secretly lived for. It was Eric's wife, Melissa, who broke the surface first, her voice soft but tinged with a kind of naive irritation, asking, "Wait, is your company really looking into buying up dental offices? Is that like an actual thing?" She wasn't asking out of curiosity, not really, but out of a need to reclaim some understanding, some sense of what the hell was actually happening, and the fact that she was looking at me instead of Eric said more than she realized. I answered with a calmness that didn't feel forced. It's one of several sectors we're exploring, yes. Healthcare-adjacent services are overdue for optimization, and we've got the infrastructure now to scale into verticals we used to only dream about. Eric shifted in his seat, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, tight, and measured in a way that made the hairs on my neck rise. "You know, you could have mentioned all this earlier. We're family, Natalie. What's the point of building something if you can't share it with the people who actually give a damn?" There it was, the accusation dressed in faux concern like a bullet wrapped in velvet. And I met his gaze without flinching because I had waited for this confrontation for years, rehearsed it in my mind during those sleepless nights when I'd questioned whether keeping my success a secret had been strength or cowardice. "You mean the people who call it a passion project? The people who ask about my job like I'm selling scented candles out of my trunk?" I let the words land slowly, one by one, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I was done editing myself to preserve the comfort of people who had never once done the same for me. "You didn't want to know, Eric. None of you did. You just wanted to believe I was trying hard enough not to embarrass you." He opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off, not with anger, but with finality. "And just so we're clear," I said, my voice low but firm, "the practice we looked into wasn't yours. But I knew about your numbers, your debt, your software issues, your missed payments. You know why? Because the assistant you laid off last year now works for me." The room froze. Eric paled. My mother gasped. A real audible gasp, like someone had slapped her with the back of a spoon. And Melissa reached for Eric's arm instinctively, her eyes darting to him with a mix of confusion and dawning horror. For a second, I regretted it, not because it wasn't true, but because I knew what it meant. I had taken the one thing Eric held over me, his unshakable image of success, and cracked it in front of the people who had built it with him. But the regret passed quickly, replaced by a kind of quiet grief. The kind that comes when you realize a line has been crossed that can never be uncrossed, that the version of your family that existed before that moment has now been permanently altered. I didn't stay for pie. I stood up, thanked Aunt Janice for the wine, hugged my dad without waiting for him to say anything, and left the house with my coat still unbuttoned and my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. Outside, the night air was sharp and honest, and I walked to my rental car slowly, not because I was reluctant, but because I was finally, fully done. Done pretending, done hoping, done needing their version of love to feel valid. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the house, still glowing with warm light, still standing like nothing had changed. And yet everything had. I didn't feel triumphant. This wasn't a victory. It wasn't revenge. Not really. It was truth, naked and unsentimental, and truth doesn't come with a round of applause. And as I drove back to the hotel, the silence in the car wasn't heavy. It was clean, empty in the way a room feels after all the furniture has been taken out. Strange, unfamiliar, but full of possibility. I didn't win, not really. I just stopped losing.